We always appreciate this guy's time, but especially this week. Biggest game of the year so far. Ohio State, Penn State. We've got it on Fox right after noon kickoff. We've got the big noon. We've got the man himself, Joel Klatt, the lead analyst for college football for Fox. And first of all, let's start here, Joel. I've done a bunch of big games. I know the feeling, but what's the difference in terms of this week compared to some of the other weeks, and how exciting is it for you just personally, knowing that like all eyes of the college football world are going to be on you? It's the big game, going to Penn State, like the history, the rivalry, all those sorts of things leading up to this one.
Well, let's just say I'm not as worried about blowout material this week, as as maybe some other weeks. And I know you know the feeling, but this one is obviously special, and I've been looking forward to this game ever since the offseason. And I also, because I think what people maybe don't realize that are just fans of this sport is that when we have these contracts, ESPN has their contract, CBS has their contract, NBC has their contract, Fox, we have our contract. Well, I end up seeing these specific teams a lot, and I end up seeing these specific coaches a lot, and I see them in the off season. And so what ends up happening is, like, I know every single storyline and even the personal ones. I know what James is feeling this weekend because of what has happened the 3 previous years. In terms of losing to Michigan and Ohio State, and that feeling and that narrative surrounding him and his program that he can't win this specific game. I know what Ryan is up against at Ohio State, and the narrative that his fan base kind of builds up. And so it's not just the game, which in and of itself is incredible, but it's all the underlying subtext of what's going on in these games, their fan bases. That's what ends up like becoming so interesting for me, and elevates the game really to a status that is hard to explain. Both of these programs and these coaches specifically desperately need to win Saturday. Yeah. And those are the best games to do. You've done them. I've done them. When you know that each team will literally do anything, do whatever it takes to win, that's when you know you're about to see something special.
Well, let's start with Ryan Day in Ohio State. Mm-hmm. Herb Street always calls it the lunatic fringe. As an alumni, he can get away with that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not going to say it.
Yeah, exactly.
He can say it.
There's certain things you can say based on your background, right?
That's right.
He says it's like 10, 15%, whatever it is. But the other 85, they're just great college football fans. They love their program. But that lunatic fringe is always the loudest, whether it's politics, sports, it doesn't matter. And you look at the record, 62-9, Joel, for Ryan Day at Ohio State. But the Michigan game, that's obviously why we're hearing some of the noise that we're hearing. I know Ryan Day pretty well. Go back to Chip Kelly with mention. I actually played at Richmond, played against Chip all the way back in the days at UNH, and Ryan Day was there. So I know these human beings.
Yeah.
What do you expect from Ryan Day when you fly in, you meet with him this week? What do you expect the mindset to be?
Well, I will tell you, I first met him when he was just a coordinator, and Urban Meyer had hired him from San Francisco. And from that point to this point, this job, that fan base, ages you a little bit, and it grows you up in the sport of football. And I think he would even be the first to say that you really have no idea until you're in it, because it's somewhat of a cauldron or a reckoning, if you will. I remember, and I'm sure you've heard this too, Todd, like a lot of the people that played for Saban or coached under Saban would say every day is a reckoning. Mm-hmm. Well, for Ohio State, and Urban would even say this as well, Coach Meyer, he would say, like, at Ohio State, every day is 4th and 1. Or, another way of putting that is every day is a reckoning. And you can feel that, on Ryan's shoulders.
Yes.
Here's the one thing that I think, and you mentioned the record, 62-9, which is staggering. I mean, it's like, what are we doing, right? Like, this is incredible. It's an elite program. And it's not always the case that somebody can take over a program that is at the top of college football, and then they can keep it there and maintain it. And in some ways move it even forward, which is what Ryan has been able to do. Now, He's been a snap or two away from winning a national championship, beating some of those teams in those big games. And that certainly weighs on him. One of the things that I've talked with him about is this idea that the more you know, the more you realize you need to learn. You know, and I think that this is true in life as well. I've certainly gone through it personally, but it's like the smarter you become, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah, you don't have all the answers, right?
That's exactly right. And the less you know, the more you think you have everything figured out.
Yeah,
I think that the exact same thing can be said for coaches. And when he was a young coach, even a young head coach, I think that there was an idea of like, no, I know what this is and I know how to do this and we're going to, you know, run through it. And the reality is you look around college football and its history, and the reality is the greatest coaches in our sports history took a while to win at the top end. You know, I mean, even Nick Saban, he had to go through the Michigan State years and then get to LSU. And it wasn't until he was into his 50s that he began that run at Alabama. Right. Same with Pete Carroll. The same thing. Tom Osborne took, 20 years to win a national championship. It took Urban Meyer, you know, growing through Bowling Green in Utah and then getting to Florida.
Right, yeah.
You know, and this idea that you just become a head coach and then you win a national championship is not historically accurate. You know, Bob Stoops ruined it for everybody. You know, Barry Switzer ruined it for everybody. So we've talked about that, and he is now at that point where he will, and this is where you know that he's comfortable with it. He will say to me like, "I learn every year," and those learning experiences are going to pay off. He's going to win at the top end at some point, and what he's got to continue to do is keep putting his team at the doorstep, because you do this enough and eventually you're going to break down that door. And I'm, you know, I know that that's a big overarching answer, but
no, it's great.
I really believe that.
Yeah.
You can tell by Mench's beard, he's a former offensive lineman. I know he's clamoring to ask you about this Ohio State offensive line.
We're going to get into the O-line. I know we are.
Yeah, I can't wait. So anyone who watched that game knows that the Ohio State left tackle making his first start for the injured Josh Simmons was in over his head. Just did not play well, both in the run game and in pass protection. But I go back and watch that tape, and I thought there were other issues up front. I thought that the right guard was a little bit of an issue for them. There were some execution issues, and I was wondering if you were just seeing some of the same things and what you thought. What's the fix here? What are they going to do to fix this?
Yeah. So yes, to answer the first part of your question, there were major issues, and not just Zen Michalski, the kid who came in at left tackle. Although he did struggle, and I think those were the most, glaring and obvious. But there were some other things going on with the offensive line, namely in this idea of it's hard for me, not having played the position, to understand really like what does it mean technically when an O-line, not a specific offensive lineman, but an O-line is playing well together. There's a cohesiveness to the movement of those five guys. Right. That when they're playing well, it's like beautiful. You know, it's almost like dance steps. Like everybody's foot steps at the same time and their hands move at the same time, and you're like, man, this is incredible. You know,
he gets it, McShay.
Well, he does.
And it's easier for me, to be honest, and Todd, I think, maybe you can relate to this. It's easier for me in the draft process to just look at a player up front and be like, okay, what does he do? Versus tell me why this offensive line is so good. It's because it's very hard to explain. And there's that cohesiveness. Like, for instance, I did Indiana the previous week. Indiana, I would say up front, probably not as individually talented as what Ohio State is up front. And yet their offensive line played better as a group, and they're more cohesive as a group. They're more connected to the structure of the offense and what the offense is trying to do and the rhythm of what the offense is trying to do. Because it's not just that everybody is moving with a cohesiveness, but it's also that they're moving in conjunction with backs and protections and wide receivers and pictures and timing, and that everything just kind of looks correct. don't see that with Ohio State. And now you're going to change things up. I'm expecting, I don't know this to be a fact, and I haven't talked to them yet, obviously. I'm expecting Donovan Jackson to bump out to left tackle. He's an All-American guard that now all of a sudden, and by the way, he is not one of these linemen, and guys, you know that this happens all over. It's like, oh, he's played all over the offensive line. He's played at center and guard, and, you know, he's bounced around through his few years. I can't think of, there was a guy last year. Gosh, who was it? In the draft. Anyways, this happens where their best offensive lineman ends up playing all the different positions. That hasn't been Donovan. Donovan has been a guard, right? His entire career. And so bumping out for this
different world
game,
out there.
It's a totally different world. By the way, and it's a different world just period. At Happy Valley, holy cow.
Right, yeah.
With Abdul Carter coming and
with Abdul Carter coming, I always go back to calling the Michigan-Penn State game a year ago. And, you know, everybody has an opinion on Michigan's 32 straight runs in that game. We all, right? And it was like, oh, they went bully ball and, you know, Michigan, oh, look at that. They can run. They ran the ball 32 straight times because they couldn't block Chop Robinson.
Right.
It was impossible. He ran around the right tackle twice on the first two series, and like JJ barely got the ball away, and he was on rhythm. And so it was a panic move. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it, but it was like, okay, screw it. Extra offensive linemen, extra tight ends. Let's create width.
It's the safest route.
It's the safest route. That's exactly right. So now let's back up. Okay, so you asked about the Ohio State offensive line. So now you're going to bump a true guard out to tackle, and who knows who's going to play guard.
Exactly. Now you're weaker in the middle.
That's a problem,
right,
guys? Yeah. Like so now this offensive line and this offense, I think, is going to have a completely different fingerprint than what Chip really wants. And I could see that last week against Indiana. Long answer that I'll try to boil down to this. I felt Chip calling the game last week for the rest of the season. He was forcing the run so heavily because he was thinking to himself, like, I've got to, one, figure out what I've got up front, and two, get them going. And so they were just running it. And Nebraska is playing into their hands because for them, after the previous week against Indiana, they were like, hell or high water, we're going to allow them to run for 200 yards. So they're just like, bang, they're in there. Hutmaker's in there. Ty Robinson's in there. They're in the middle. They're not wide in their odd front, you know, creating bubbles. They're in tight. They're playing quality defense. They're getting after it. And Chip is like banging his head against a wall trying to run the football because he knows that he'd like to run the football for the rest of the season. Correct. And there's this little bit of anxiety about like, well, if we can't run it today, like, will we be able to run it in the future? I want to try to get some success. Then you look up at the end of the game, guys, and it's a 4-point game, and Dylan Raiola is on the field with a chance to win the game, and Jeremiah Smith has had 4 targets. Yeah. And you're like, that can't happen. And it was because of the offensive line.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the targets. It was amazing to me that he wasn't targeted more in that game. Well, and then you have one of the most talented backfields in the country, and if you can't get those guys going, I mean, it's a different team if they can't figure that O-line out.
Yeah, and I know it's not the scheme, you know, Todd, you and I, and Steve, with your O-line background, we know that Chip. There is not a better run game offensive coach, I think, in the sport than Chip Kelly. He's done it with all levels of offensive line and levels of back, and he's been successful. You know, those 2 backs are incredible players with what they've got in their past, so that you start ticking away these variables of like, well, what's the problem here? Well, I know it's not the scheme. Yeah, I know it's not the backs. And it's like, well, it's the 5 guys up front, and they've got to figure that out.
Well, obviously, when you have a talent like Jeremiah Smith, Chip will find ways, right?
Todd, before you finish, dude, like I'm gonna like throw a question back because you know that it can be easy sometimes in our industry, and with what we do, to overstate sometimes, you know, with players, because they could be like the best on their team or this year or things. And you're wanting to try to categorize, like, I've tried to pump the brakes on this guy, but it's like,
don't bother.
Yeah, don't.
I have not seen this. This is he for me in my career is one of one for this age and that position. I've never seen anything like it. And I've seen all of these guys come through Ohio State. Brian Hartline has seen all of these guys come through Ohio State.
Well, we just had the greatest of all time, right? Like Marvin Harrison Jr. How do you find? But this guy's got a chance to maybe be even better.
I agree. I think that if he were to just like continue to stay healthy and to continue to stay hungry, he will be without question a top 2-3 wide receiver in the NFL sometime fairly soon. And if he stays healthy and hungry, like he'll be an all-time great.
Yes.
There's no doubt.
And what's crazy,
Dude, he is ridiculous. God, I'm watching the film, dude. The guy is 6'3", 220. 6'3", 220. And he's just blowing by guys at the second level with his second level release. So I asked him, I was like, hey, on the catapult, like, what is he touching? And they're like, oh, he touches 23. And I'm like,
gosh,
23?
Wow.
23.
At that size.
Yeah, like I look at him, you kind of like a young Julio Jones, but Julio Jones ran like a 4.5 something, Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's fun to watch, and you look across the landscape, right? Like Texas has got a great one, Alabama's got a great one with Ryan Williams, and they're all phenomenal. And my brain, unfortunately, the way it's wired, I'm like 2027, all right, 2027 draft.
I know.
Like we could have like 2 or 3 receivers in the top 5. Like these
guys I agree. Well, and Smith, to me, it's like if someone needs a quarterback, fine, they'll take a quarterback that year. But he's already the best position. He might be the best position player this year.
Yeah.
Like if he could go to the draft, he could be like the 2nd, 3rd pick in the draft this year.
I agree. I actually agree. And I'm very careful about those things.
I know.
'Cause they always come back to bite me, but
I know.
I don't disagree. So how about the guy getting him the ball? I love the stories. I guess it's just being on the road doing games for so long. You try to find the stories and things that are interesting. And Will Howard, talking this week about, he like Downington West High School, born in Westchester, PA. Dream was to play at Penn State, was kind of got shunned by Penn State in recruiting. And now you got this shot. Like, how excited are you to tell that story? And what else can you shed a light on?
I love this. I love this storyline because this, in a lot of ways, I just relate to it. Bottom line, I was a guy that wasn't recruited at the top end in football. In fact, I was just like a Division II recruit. When I came out of high school, I was a 3-sport player, and I was a very good baseball player, and was a Division II recruit. South Dakota State. I went up to Brookings. I went to North Dakota State, Northern Colorado. And, that was it. And I wanted to play for Sonny Lubick at CSU so bad, right? Like that was just, I was like, man, because Colorado to me was like, well, man, they're like, they're too good for me. I go and I play baseball for 3 seasons. And then I decided like I need a degree. I need to change my life. And I was going to quit baseball. And so I decided to go to school at Colorado. I didn't quit baseball to go play football at Colorado.
Interesting. I didn't know this.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know this either.
And then once that happened, the coaching staff was like, well, you got to walk on, if you're going to be here and you have eligibility.
Yeah. And
so I walked on at Colorado, not thinking really anything of it. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh man, I could play. And so all of a sudden that it starts to unfold that way. And then I get to play and start against Colorado State. And dude, I used to be so jacked up for that game because I was like, these guys passed. Like they didn't. And what they had done is there was a really good player that was a year younger than me in high school in our state. And then there were a couple of really good players that were in my grade. And one of them went to Arizona State. I can't remember his name. Anyways, and then the other was Craig Oaks. And Craig Oaks went to Colorado. And then the guy younger than me, CSU decided like, well, we want him. His name was Justin Holland. So they didn't offer me, and they
never forget those names, right?
Never. Yes, exactly. So, and I got to play Justin Holland, in college.
Yeah.
Like I didn't forget that. And I remember like I wanted to run across the field and say to Sonny Lubick, like, how do you like me now? Like
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
jacked up outside of what I would normally be for those games. So I give that personal anecdote to tell you, like, I can't wait to see what Will does and to see how he reacts and plays, because for him, he will always, not just because it's a big game, but he will always remember this opportunity to go and play against Penn State and the program that he desperately wanted to play for.
Do you remember your stat line in that Colorado State game? Do you remember what you threw for?
That was my very first start ever.
I want to know.
I threw. They were ranked. Bradley Van Pelt was their quarterback.
Oh yeah,
and he was an older guy. They were favored. Everyone was like, Colorado's going to start a walk-on. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah,
and we beat them 42-35. I threw for 417 yards.
Ooh. Yes. Yes. Tight game too. I love it.
That's right.
I love it, man.
How do you like me now, son?
Exactly. Oh man, I love those stories. All right, so we're always looking here on this show at NFL talent and all that. Defensively, it's hard for me because Ohio State is loaded with veterans on defense.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about how, extremely talented this defense is, and it is, right? But I look at, like, you go back over the history, like every year at Alabama when they were winning championships, it was like, all right, we just lost four first rounders on the defensive side of the draft, but they got 3 more coming back next year. Georgia's been the same way. It's like, 5 guys in the top 50, 9 guys in the top 100, right? This group, maybe there's 1 first rounder, but a bunch of day 2, second, third, maybe 4th round picks, loaded with talent, bunch of veterans. When everyone talks about elite, I don't know that they're elite by that standard, that we've seen, but they got a chance to be really good. What have you seen, and who's jumped out for you on Ohio State's defense?
So the guys that you would come into this season saying they've got a chance to play themselves into the first round haven't played that way yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part of the problem. These guys are very good pass rushers, came in as 2 of the top 5 players in the country, and it's just never quite gotten there, in terms of dominance at the college level. They're very good. They create a lot of pressure, but the production numbers as far as getting to the quarterback aren't what the pressure numbers would indicate. They're top 5 in the country in pressures, and yet they're like 33rd in sacks. So to me, that's an issue. You got to get home. The defensive tackles, which they thought were going to be elite, Tyleik Williams being one of them, hasn't played like a first-round player. The corners who they thought could be first-round corners haven't played like first-round corners. Right. So what you've got now is because of that, I feel them starting to press schematically. See, when your players are out there and they're playing at a really, really, really high level, you don't have to do much defensively. Nope. And that's, I think, now Saban's always a bit of an anomaly because he was going to be intricate, in particular in the secondary anyways. Todd, we watched these guys and they were in brackets and they're doing all sorts of different stuff in the back end. But when I look at other defenses that I thought were ridiculously talented, they didn't have to do much. The 19 Ohio State defense schematically did not do much because those guys, and I'm talking about like the Chase Young, Jeff Okudah defense, they didn't have to do much schematically, and they were fine with that. I even go back to a team that I played against in 2005, that Texas team that won the national championship, and they had 2 Thorpe Award winners in the back end, and they had all these guys. They ran like 2 defenses. They ran like stack 4-3, and then they would walk up Sam and Will and run cover 0 double crash. And it was like, that was it, but it's like, well, fine. We're just better than you. Michigan's defense last year, it wasn't intricate necessarily. They would sit there and they did a great job schematically against Washington with what they did in their coverage. But to me, Jesse Minter, he understood that it was more about depth, playing a lot of snaps and staying fresh up front. It was about maintaining levels of defense. Just make sure you're not giving up an easy touchdown. And then in the moments that you need it for the team, then you get aggressive. So we used to talk a lot about, like, he always said, this is Jesse Minter for Michigan's defensive coordinator a year ago. And he and I used to talk about this idea that in the third quarter, he always felt like the way that they played, there was going to be one series where he could end the game in the third quarter. And he thought it was always going to come, like, if we score on offense in the third quarter at any point, either to take the lead or with the lead already and we score, the next series, he was like, a 3-and-out breaks their back. It's over because of our style, the time of possession. And, you know, he understood that. So he used to take what I used to say about the boa constrictor, and he would say that was our moment to squeeze. Yeah. And then they would get aggressive and they would squeeze. And then all of a sudden you get a 3-and-out, you get a punt. Now another long drive. Now you're into the fourth quarter and it's a 2-possession game and it's over.
Right.
And it's over. Right. And okay, so how does that relate to this Ohio State defense? Well, because their players, I don't feel like, have played to the level that they thought that they would individually as far as the production. They're having to manipulate the structure. When you manipulate the structure, you are more susceptible to the big play. And that's exactly what happened against Oregon. And then I think they're going to be more susceptible to the big play moving forward, because their answer after Oregon was more aggression. They did more things, rather than a straight 4-man pass rush. They started to do stunts, twists, and blitz. And that's what they did on third down, which was a little bit different, and that's going to promote more one-on-one coverage. And so we're going to see Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun, their two corners. They're going to be on an island, and we're going to see if they can hold up, because they didn't against Oregon.
Yeah, statistically, they have 20 sacks, and JT leads the team with 4.5. I mean, they're getting that pressure from all. It's just, you look at the stats and you can see they've got DBs, safeties, linebackers. Those are the kind of guys they're rushing right now. So the numbers back it up.
So let's look at it the opposite side now, right? Like Penn State. Where are we at quarterback? Obviously, Drew Aller comes out the injury. I know it's always going to be tight-lipped and what's going to happen there. Bo Perbula, I think I'm pronouncing it right. You'll know better than me at this point. I kind of liked him, man.
I do too.
I
do too. Especially, basically, think about what I just talked about: man defense, single coverage. Well, guess what? Man defense hates a running quarterback. That's when you give up explosive runs to the quarterback. Yes. And so, in some ways, I think Perbula might even be like a better matchup against Ohio State. I know that's maybe people don't want to hear that. That's not a knock against Drew Aller, because I think he's incredibly talented. I really do. But when you've got, traditional pass rushing defensive ends, and you've got a defense that wants to play man coverage and be aggressive, man, a guy that can elude and create with his legs becomes so dangerous. So Perbula, I don't think it's the worst problem to have this week. Would you like Aller back? Probably, because I think playing with both of those guys would actually be, even more beneficial. But if you have to go with Bo Perbula, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world.
Interesting. Ty Warren. I mean, he's.
I love this guy.
I love him too. So back at Richmond, the center of the football universe. I know.
The Spiders.
The Spiders. Frank Leonard was our coach, a tight ends coach, and every year he's got a new tight end. He's at Penn State now, and he raves about it. Just loves the human being, the work ethic, and then you see the tape, and he's phenomenal. We know what he is, and we know what he can provide. We know how they're going to try to utilize him. Who else are you looking for, though? Who's got to have a big game for Penn State, weapons-wise?
So, this is a great question, and this is what James and I talk about a lot, is that he thinks that what has really held them back is that they have not had that wide receiver step up and be able to just win in a big moment and stay on the field on the third down. He had to play that in Marvin Harrison 2 years ago. You watch that tape of Ohio State with Stroud and Harrison 2 years ago in Happy Valley. And it's like that Penn State team had a great chance, and then Marvin and Stroud just kind of took over the game.
Yep.
And in particular on third down, and Joey Porter couldn't cover him. And, it's just like they had an elite player elevate the rest of the team to a point of a win. And Penn State hasn't had that ability. So it's tougher on them to move the ball. They have to be with the chains. They don't have a guy that they can feel like is just going to win on the outside and get that elite wide receiver play. And then I watched the USC film, and I'm like, what allowed them to come back and win on some of those fourth downs? They got some wide receiver play, and they got some completions in big moments, whether it was Trey Wallace or Julian Fleming. These guys won in big moments. That's what they need. I'm pretty confident in everything else I'm going to get from Penn State. I know their defense is going to be aggressive and athletic and long, and they're going to run, man. Like that's what I'm going to get from the Nittany Lions. I know that I'm going to get a team that can run the football with two really strong backs. We'll get some RPOs. We're going to get the tight end moving all around. It's going to be creative with Andy Kotelnicki. He'll take some of his shots. What I don't know is what level of production or play am I going to get on the outside? To me, that's where the entire game lands for Penn State. So I'm looking at those two names that I mentioned, Trey Wallace. I'm looking at Julian Fleming, maybe a couple of those other guys. Can they give Tyler Warren some help? Because I don't think you can go out and expect 17 catches again from Warren. Like Ohio State's going to be ready for that. And Ohio State has better matchups than USC did on the tight end, namely Caleb Downs. He's going to be there looking at 44. So those guys have to play big on the outside.
This is the game, right? For Franklin, right? This is the one that they have not been able to win. He's been upfront about it in years past. Like if they're going to take it to another level, this is the game, the type of game that they've got to win. If it's different, if the result is different this year, why will that be the case?
I just touched on wide receivers. I think one of those guys will have to make a big play. And then I look at that O-line for Ohio State.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of this, like if you just go to 30,000 feet for a second, and you're James Franklin and you're Penn State, and you don't have to see Michigan, this year. You don't have to see Oregon. And Ohio State's already lost a game in the Big Ten against Oregon. A second loss eliminates them from the Big Ten championship. Like, now they might still go to the playoff, but with Indiana being undefeated, like it eliminates them from the Big Ten championship game. So you've got a chance to really de facto eliminate the Buckeyes in the Big Ten. And they're going to come in with an absolute patchwork offensive line off of a game in which they only ran the football for 2.1 yards per carry. Like, this is it, man.
Yeah. Like
you are at home. And again, I know that there are injury issues. Yeah, the quarterback's banged up. Denied Dennis Sutton was banged up last week. The other defensive end opposite Abdul Carter. But there are moments when it's like you just have to go out and you just have to do it. And Michigan had to cross that threshold a couple of years ago and finally beat Ohio State. And this is kind of one of those moments for Penn State. You've got to go do it. He hasn't beaten Penn State Ohio State since that 16 year. Remember when they blocked the field goal, he kind of shaves his jaw. They go down and they end up winning the Big Ten championship that year. Not that there's a ton of pressure, because they would still go to the playoff even if they lost this game. But man, if you're going to do it, this is it, man. I know this team is talented, but it's a defense that's reeling, that has given up big plays. It's a team that's reeling because they don't know what's on the offensive line. You got to win.